Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. We were looking for something different, something to shake off the monotony of our lives back in the city. A remote camping trip, far from technology, far from the humdrum of urban life, seemed like the perfect idea. So, I joined Alex, Mia, and Logan for a weekend deep in the Ironwood National Forest. It wasn't a popular spot. In fact, most people I talked to didn't even know it existed. I should have taken that as a warning. We arrived at Ironwood late in the afternoon. The road was nothing more than a narrow dirt path barely visible through the thick brush. No signs, no markers, just endless trees. The deeper we drove, the more the forest seemed to close in on us. Still, we were excited. The isolation was what we wanted. No distractions, no people. Just us and nature. The trail ended in a large circular clearing surrounded by towering pines that cast long shadows over the campsite. It looked unnatural, almost like someone had carved the space out of the forest on purpose. But we didn't dwell on it. Instead, we unloaded the car, set up our tents, and got a fire going as dusk settled in. The first strange thing happened almost immediately. Logan, always the jokester, had been tossing sticks into the fire, trying to see how many he could land on top of the burning logs. Then, out of nowhere, he stopped. He was standing near the edge of the clearing, just staring out into the trees. "What's up?" Mia asked, noticing his sudden silence. He didn't answer at first. He just stood there motionless, peering into the woods. I walked over to him, nudging his shoulder. "Logan?" I thought I saw someone," he muttered, shaking his head like he was trying to snap out of a daze. I followed his gaze into the forest. Nothing, just trees and the growing darkness. "There's no one out here but us," I said, trying to laugh it off. "Maybe you've been working too hard. You're seeing things." Logan chuckled weakly, but I could see the unease in his eyes. "Yeah, probably just my imagination." We all settled back around the fire, talking and joking, trying to push away the odd feeling that hung over the clearing. But as the night deepened, the sense of isolation grew heavier, oppressive. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the tents, and the forest beyond was impossibly dark. That's when we heard it. A soft rustling like footsteps coming from the tree line. It was slow, deliberate, too rhythmic to be an animal. We all went silent, exchanging uneasy glances. "Did you hear that?" Mia whispered, her voice tight. Alex, who had been poking at the fire with a stick, nodded slowly. "Yeah." Logan stood up, scanning the edge of the clearing with narrowed eyes. "Maybe it's another camper?" "In the middle of nowhere?" I replied. "We're miles from the nearest trail. Who the hell would be out here?" As if to answer my question, the rustling grew louder, closer. It circled us just beyond the firelight, moving through the trees in a wide arc around the clearing. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my skin crawling with the sensation of being watched. "Whatever it is, it's messing with us," Logan muttered, grabbing a flashlight. "I'm gonna check it out." Before anyone could stop him, he strode toward the tree line, shining the light into the trees. The rest of us stood up, instinctively moving closer to the fire. The warmth suddenly felt like the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. "See anything?" Alex called out, his voice tense. Logan didn't answer. He was standing still again, just like before, the flashlight beam sweeping through the trees, catching nothing but branches and shadows. Then he started walking forward, disappearing into the woods. "Logan, wait!" Mia shouted, but he was already gone, swallowed by the forest. I grabbed my own flashlight and hurried after him, the others following close behind. The moment we stepped past the tree line, the clearing seemed to vanish. The trees were thick, their branches knitting together overhead, blocking out the moonlight. The air felt colder, heavier. "Logan," I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the silence. Nothing, just the rustling of leaves and then, faintly, the sound of footsteps ahead. We followed the sound, pushing through the underbrush, our flashlights barely cutting through the darkness. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I could feel the others' growing panic. After a few minutes, we found him. Logan was standing in the middle of a narrow trail, his back to us, staring at something ahead. "What the hell, man?" Alex said, grabbing Logan's shoulder. "You can't just wander off like that." Logan didn't move, didn't even flinch. "Logan?" I stepped in front of him, shining my flashlight in his face. His eyes were wide, unfocused, like he wasn't even seeing us. I followed his gaze, turning my flashlight toward the path ahead. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. A figure standing between the trees, tall and thin. Too thin. Its limbs were long, almost unnaturally so, its skin pale and stretched tight across its bones. But it wasn't the figure itself that sent ice down my spine, it was its eyes. They were huge, black and reflective, like mirrors, catching the light from my flashlight and throwing it back at me. It was just standing there watching us. "Logan, come on," I whispered, grabbing his arm and tugging him back. He blinked, snapping out of his trance, and stumbled backward, his face pale. What is that?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its head slightly tilted, those reflective eyes locked on us. "We need to go," Alex said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now." None of us argued. We turned and hurried back down the trail. Logan still dazed, Mia and Alex casting nervous glances over their shoulders every few seconds. I kept my flashlight trained on the ground, too afraid to look back. We stumbled into the clearing, breathless and collapsed by the fire. The oppressive feeling of being watched was still there, heavier than before. I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see those black, mirror-like eyes staring back at us. "Did you see it?" Logan finally whispered, his voice shaky. "That thing?" We all nodded, none of us willing to put it into words. We just sat there, huddled close to the fire, staring into the flames, too terrified to even consider going to sleep. The rustling started again. This time it was louder, more insistent, like something was circling us faster, closer. We all stood up, flashlights flickering toward the sound, but we couldn't see anything, just the trees, the shadows, and the darkness beyond. Then the whispers began. They were soft, almost unintelligible, coming from every direction at once, faint voices murmuring just at the edge of hearing. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew, deep down, that they weren't human. "We need to leave," I said, my voice barely steady. "Now." We didn't pack up, we didn't care. We grabbed what we could, our bags, our lights, and we ran. Through the trees, stumbling over roots and rocks, not daring to look back. The whispers followed us, growing louder with every step, and in the corner of my eye, I kept seeing them, those tall, thin figures, standing just beyond the edge of the light, their black eyes reflecting the moonlight. We made it back to the car just as the first light of dawn broke through the trees. We didn't speak, didn't stop to breathe until we were miles away from Ironwood, the forest shrinking in the rearview mirror. None of us ever talked about what happened that night. We pretended it was just a bad dream, a trick of the mind. But I know the truth. I know what I saw. And I know they're still out there, in that clearing, watching, waiting. I can still hear the whispers. I've always been a rational person. You know the type. Grounded, logical, a firm believer in things that can be seen, touched, and explained. So when my girlfriend Claire suggested we take a weekend camping trip to an old, nearly abandoned state park, I didn't think twice. I loved the idea of getting away, deep into the woods, just the two of us. Little did I know, those woods had something waiting for us. Something I can't explain. The park was tucked away, miles off any major road. It used to be popular decades ago, but the state rerouted the main highway and the place slowly withered away. Only the diehard campers or locals went there anymore. That sounded perfect to me. No noisy crowds, just nature and quiet. We arrived mid-afternoon, parking our car at the small gravel lot near the ranger station. The building was old, weathered, with no one inside. A faded map of the park was pinned to a bulletin board, but most of the trails were overgrown or unmarked. Claire was excited, and I could feel that sense of adventure kicking in. We grabbed our gear and set off down one of the more accessible trails, winding through the thick forest. The trees were massive, their branches intertwined so densely that the sunlight barely filtered through. It was eerie but beautiful, and the isolation was exactly what we'd been looking for. After hiking for a couple of hours, we found a spot near a creek, a small clearing just big enough for our tent. We set up camp, the sound of the flowing water calming and constant. As the sun sank lower, casting the forest in hues of gold and shadow, I gathered wood for a fire, while Claire laid out some snacks. Everything was going perfectly. Too perfectly. The first sign that something was off came as night fell. The fire was crackling, the air was cool but comfortable, and we were just talking about random things. Life, work, future plans. That's when we heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was faint, almost like a stick tapping against a tree. I thought it was just the wind at first, but then it came again, 3 slow taps. Silence. Then 3 more. "Did you hear that?" Claire asked, her voice low. I nodded, looking around. The forest, once filled with the sounds of birds and insects, had gone dead silent. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, just the tapping. "Maybe it's a woodpecker," I offered, trying to keep the mood light, though something in my gut felt wrong. Woodpeckers don't tap like that. The tapping continued, steady, methodical, as if it was coming from all around us. Claire stood looking into the trees, her face pale in the firelight. "That's not an animal," she whispered. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the woods. The beam barely penetrated the darkness, revealing only more trees, gnarled and ancient. No movement, no animals, nothing. The tapping stopped, just like that. I sighed in relief, chuckling nervously. "See? Probably nothing." But Claire didn't laugh. Her eyes were fixed on something just beyond the firelight. I followed her gaze, shining the flashlight over, but saw nothing unusual. "What is it?" I asked. I thought I saw something," she murmured. "Something big." I scoffed, though my skin prickled. "Big? Like a deer?" She shook her head. "No, taller, much taller." I wanted to dismiss it. My rational brain kicked in, reminding me that people often see shapes in the shadows, especially in the woods at night. It's just tricks of the light, our minds playing games with us. But something in Claire's voice made me feel uneasy. She wasn't the type to scare easily. I tried to change the subject, suggesting we eat, maybe have a drink, but Claire stayed uneasy, her eyes darting to the trees every few seconds. The fire seemed to shrink, even as I fed it more wood, as if the darkness was pressing closer. That's when we heard it again, the tapping. But this time it was louder, closer, and there was something else. A voice, faint, almost like a whisper carried on the breeze. "Claire?" We both froze. The voice was soft, distant, but unmistakably calling her name. "Did you hear that?" Claire whispered, her hand gripping my arm tightly. I nodded, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Yeah, I did." "Who's out there?" I yelled into the darkness, trying to sound braver than I felt. But no one answered. The tapping stopped, replaced by a stillness that was even more unsettling. "Let's just pack up and go," Claire said suddenly, her voice trembling. "I don't want to stay here anymore." I nodded in agreement. The uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at me was now a full-blown alarm. Something wasn't right, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what it was. We started packing quickly, but as we did, something moved in the trees. A shadow, tall and gangly, just at the edge of our vision. I turned my flashlight toward it, but it vanished behind the trees. Too fast, too quiet. "Did you see that?" Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't answer. My heart was pounding, and all I could think about was getting out of there. We grabbed our gear, leaving the fire burning, and started down the trail, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark. As we walked, the forest around us seemed to change. The trees felt closer, their branches twisting overhead like claws reaching for us. The air grew colder, heavier, and the silence was oppressive. Every step felt like we were being watched. And then, we heard it again. The tapping. It was louder now, echoing through the trees, and the voice came with it, closer, clearer. "Claire, come back." Claire squeezed my hand, her breathing shallow, her eyes wide with fear. "Who the hell is that?" she whispered. I didn't answer. I couldn't, because deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The voice, it sounded wrong, too flat, too hollow, like someone trying to imitate a person, but not quite getting it right. We quickened our pace, practically running down the trail, but the tapping followed us, growing louder and faster, keeping pace with us. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. Something tall, impossibly tall, moving through the trees. It didn't walk. It glided, silent and smooth, its limbs too long, its body too thin. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Claire's arm, and we bolted down the trail, the tapping now a frantic beat behind us like a drum echoing in the night. We didn't stop running until we burst out of the trees and into the parking lot, panting and drenched in sweat. The tapping had stopped, but the silence remained, thick and unnatural. I fumbled with the car keys, throwing our gear into the trunk as quickly as possible. Claire was already in the passenger seat, her face pale, her hands shaking. I started the car and we peeled out of the lot, gravel spraying behind us. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The woods were dark, impenetrable. But just at the edge of the trees, standing perfectly still, was a figure. Tall, thin, watching us. I haven't been camping since that night. I haven't told anyone else about what we saw. Claire won't talk about it either, but sometimes late at night when the world is quiet and dark, I can still hear it. The tapping, steady, rhythmic. And sometimes just on the edge of sleep I hear the voice calling my name. I've always loved the idea of getting away from it all, taking a break from the noise, from the city, from people. There's something pure about being alone in nature, miles from anyone, with nothing but the trees and the stars for company. Last weekend, I decided to do just that. I packed my tent, some basic supplies, and drove up to a remote spot in the woods that I'd found on an old hiking forum. Hardly anyone knows about it, and it promised exactly what I wanted: complete isolation. It was a 4-hour drive through winding back roads, the kind that don't show up on maps, and I felt my excitement build with each mile. The further I went, the more the world fell away. By the time I parked my car at the edge of the forest and set off on foot, it felt like I was the only person left on Earth. I hiked for about an hour, deeper into the woods than I'd ever been, until I found the perfect clearing. It was surrounded by tall, ancient trees that creaked and whispered in the wind. The ground was carpeted in thick moss, and the air smelled like pine and damp earth. It felt right, safe. I set up camp as the sun started to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I knew I had maybe an hour or two of daylight left, so I quickly gathered some firewood and started a small fire to ward off the chill that was beginning to creep in. I ate a quick meal and settled into my camp chair, watching the fire crackle and spit, and listening to the quiet. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. But as the light faded and the darkness closed in, that peace began to feel different. The silence wasn't soothing anymore. It was thick, oppressive. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. like something was watching me from the shadows. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just nerves, the natural unease of being alone in the woods. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I heard it then, a rustling in the underbrush, not far from my camp. I froze, straining to hear over the sound of my own heartbeat. The rustling grew louder, more insistent, until I could pinpoint its source just beyond the glow of my campfire. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in the direction of the noise, half expecting to see a deer or maybe a curious raccoon. But there was nothing, just trees and shadows. I turned off the flashlight and sat back down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there watching me. I told myself it was my imagination, but I couldn't relax. My skin prickled, and my instincts screamed at me to leave. I tried to calm myself down, taking deep breaths and reminding myself that I was alone out here. Nothing was going to happen. Nothing could happen. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the light of the fire, standing at the edge of the trees, was a figure. It was tall, almost unnaturally so, and its limbs seemed too long, too thin. I could just make out the outline, a vague shadow in the darkness, but I knew it wasn't human. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me, rooting me to the spot. I knew I should get up, grab my things and run, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in that moment, staring at this thing that should not exist. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. But there was no logic, no explanation. It was there, and it was real. Slowly, the figure took a step forward, its long, spindly legs moving in a jerky, unnatural way. I heard a low growl, deep and guttural, like nothing I'd ever heard before. The sound resonated through the trees, vibrating in my chest, and I felt a primal terror grip me. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this thing as possible. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing my flashlight and my bag, and took off into the woods, leaving the fire behind. I didn't care where I was going, didn't care that I had no sense of direction. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear it behind me, the sound of branches snapping and leaves rustling, growing closer with every step. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I couldn't go any further. My legs gave out, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. I turned my flashlight back, shining it into the darkness, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I sat there, catching my breath, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the silence was different now, thick and heavy, like the forest was holding its breath again. And then I heard it, a low rumbling growl, closer this time. I whipped around, my flashlight beam catching a pair of glowing yellow eyes, staring at me from the darkness. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and tripped over a tree root, falling hard onto my back. The flashlight flew out of my hand, landing somewhere in the underbrush. I was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of those eyes. They moved closer, slow and deliberate, and I could hear the creature breathing, a harsh, rasping sound that sent chills down my spine. I scrambled to my feet, trying to find my flashlight, but my hand shook too much to be of any use. I could feel the creature's gaze on me, its presence heavy and suffocating. I had to move, had to get away, but I was trapped, surrounded by darkness and fear. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a voice, a low, whispering voice, speaking in a language I didn't understand. The words seemed to slither through the air, wrapping around me like tendrils of smoke. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but the voice grew louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear. And then suddenly it stopped. The forest was silent again, but the creature was gone. I could feel it, sense its absence like a weight lifted off my chest. I stood there, trembling, waiting for something to happen, but the woods were still, empty. I found my flashlight and shone it around, but there was no sign of the creature. No glowing eyes or shadowy figure. It was as if it had never been there, but I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard. I could still feel the chill of its presence lingering in the air like a cold breath on the back of my neck. I didn't sleep that night. I packed up my things and made my way back to the car as soon as the sun began to rise, not stopping until I was safely locked inside, miles away from those cursed woods. I drove home in a daze, replaying the events over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. But there was no sense to be made, no explanation that fit. It was only later, after I'd returned home, that I realized something was wrong. I was standing in front of my bathroom mirror washing my face when I saw it. Something dark, just behind my reflection. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just an empty room, silent and still. But when I turned back to the mirror, the shadow was there again, hovering just over my shoulder, a pair of glowing yellow eyes staring back at me. And then, in a voice that was not my own, I heard a whisper, "You're never alone." As much as I try to forget that night, I can't shake the feeling that it followed me home, that somewhere, out there, in the shadows, it's still watching, waiting. And sometimes when I'm alone, I hear that low growl, that whispering voice echoing through the silence. I don't know what it was or why it chose me, but I do know one thing. I'll never go back to those woods again, because some things are meant to stay hidden in the darkness, and sometimes they follow you home. I've always been a sucker for a good adventure, especially when it involved getting away from the noise of the city and disappearing into the wilderness. So when my brother, Tom, suggested a weekend camping trip in the remote forests of northern Maine, I didn't hesitate. He'd found a place deep in the woods, untouched by hikers or tourists, far from any civilization. A perfect escape. We packed light, just the essentials: food, water, tent, a couple of flashlights. No cell service that far out, of course, but that's what we wanted. A break from the modern world. The first day of hiking was beautiful. Dense forest stretched for miles in every direction, the trees towering above us like ancient sentinels, their branches knitting together to form a canopy that filtered the sunlight. The air smelled of pine and earth, clean and crisp. We walked for hours, finally reaching a small clearing by a pristine lake just as the sun began to set. It was the kind of place you only see in postcards. We set up camp, built a fire, and spent the evening trading stories and laughing. The forest was alive with the usual sounds: leaves rustling, crickets chirping, the occasional owl hooting in the distance. Nothing out of the ordinary. As night fell, the temperature dropped, but the fire kept us warm. Everything felt peaceful, perfect. But that night, things started to get strange. It was sometime after midnight when I woke up. The fire had burned down to embers and the forest had gone completely silent. It wasn't just quiet, it was dead. No wind, no crickets, no rustling leaves. Just an oppressive, unnatural stillness. I sat up, blinking in the darkness, listening. Then I heard it. A soft, barely audible whisper carried on what little breeze there was. At first I thought it was Tom talking in his sleep, but when I listened more closely, the voice wasn't coming from his tent. It was coming from the trees, from the forest itself. "I hear you." The whisper was faint, like it was being carried from far away, but it was there. I froze, my heart beginning to pound. I told myself it had to be the wind, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me after a long day of hiking. But then it came again, clearer this time. "I see you." I grabbed my flashlight, flicking it on and shining the beam toward the tree line. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I stood up, scanning the area around our camp. Everything looked normal. But that voice, it didn't sound like it belonged out here. It didn't sound like it belonged anywhere. I walked over to Tom's tent, my hand shaking slightly, and unzipped it just enough to see him curled up, fast asleep. It definitely wasn't him. I know you. The voice was closer now, like it was moving through the trees, weaving its way toward me. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned the flashlight off, hoping the darkness would somehow hide me. I crouched down by the embers of the fire, straining to hear, to make sense of the whispers. For a moment there was silence again, but then the wind picked up just a little, and with it came more voices. Not just one now, several. All whispering, all calling. It was as if the forest had come alive with the sound, like the wind itself had learned to speak. I see you. I hear you. We're waiting. My skin crawled. The whispers seemed to be everywhere, surrounding me, but every time I looked, there was nothing. I started to panic, my heart racing. I wanted to wake Tom to tell him we needed to leave, but some primal instinct kept me rooted to the spot. It felt like if I moved, if I made a sound, whatever was out there, whatever was whispering, would know. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the voices faded, carried away on the wind as suddenly as they had come. The silence returned, thick and heavy, but this time, it felt like a relief. I crawled back into my tent, forcing myself to breathe slowly, to calm down. I convinced myself it had just been the wind playing tricks on me. It had to be. The forest was full of strange noises at night, right? I lay there staring up at the roof of the tent, waiting for sleep to take me again. The next morning, Tom woke up cheerful, completely unaware of what had happened. I didn't mention the whispers. I didn't want to sound like I was losing it. Instead, we packed up and decided to explore the area around the lake. It was a beautiful day, sunlight filtering through the trees, the air crisp and clear. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows darting between the trees. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. By late afternoon, we found ourselves at the edge of an old trail, overgrown and barely visible. Tom wanted to follow it, see where it led, but I wasn't so sure. The uneasy feeling I'd had all day was growing stronger, like a knot tightening in my stomach. "Come on," Tom said, grinning. "Let's see where it goes. Could be something cool." Against my better judgment, I followed him. The trail wound deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser, the air cooler. The further we went, the more I felt like we were being watched. The whispers from the night before echoed in the back of my mind, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. After about an hour, we came across a clearing. At the center stood the remains of an old, weathered cabin, its walls collapsed and overgrown with vines. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, maybe longer. "Wow," Tom said, stepping closer. "This is amazing. How did this even get out here?" I didn't answer. I was too focused on the strange feeling that was creeping over me, the sense that we weren't supposed to be here. As we explored the cabin, I found something strange. Carved into the wooden beams were symbols, strange, looping patterns and spirals that didn't make any sense. Some looked like animals, others like faces, twisted and distorted. They weren't anything I recognized. And then I heard the whisper again. "I know you." It was faint, barely audible, but it was there, unmistakable. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the corners of the cabin. Nothing, just rotting wood and shadows. "We should go," I said, my voice shaking slightly. Tom frowned at me. "What's wrong with you? It's just an old cabin." "We need to go now," I insisted, backing toward the edge of the clearing. The air had changed. It was heavier, colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker. That's when the wind picked it up again, and with it came the voices. "I see you. I hear you. We're waiting." This time Tom heard it too. He froze, his eyes wide, and looked at me. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," I whispered, "but we need to get out of here." We didn't waste any more time. We ran, crashing through the underbrush, following the barely visible trail back toward the lake. The whispers followed us, growing louder, more insistent. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the voices with it, like the forest itself was alive, like it was chasing us. By the time we reached our campsite, the voices had faded again, but the feeling of being watched never left. We packed up and left that day. Neither of us spoke much on the drive home, and we never went back to that part of the woods. I still don't know what those voices were, or why they were calling to us. But every now and then, when I'm alone in the quiet of the night, I swear I can hear them again, whispering, waiting. I love camping. There's something about the smell of the pine trees, the crackle of the campfire, and the vast starry sky above that always made me feel more alive. So, when my friend Tom suggested a weekend camping trip to the depths of the Blackwoods, I jumped at the chance. I'd heard stories about the place, of course. They called it the Whispering Woods. People said it was haunted, cursed even. But I'd never been one to believe in ghost stories. We set out early Friday morning. The sky was a slate-gray dome above us, thick with clouds, and the air carried a hint of rain. After about a 2-hour drive, we reached the trailhead. The forest stretched before us, tall and dense, as if daring us to enter. It was a solid wall of trees that seemed to absorb the light, swallowing it whole. I should have taken that as a sign. The first couple of hours were uneventful. We followed a narrow trail through the trees, stopping occasionally to take photos or admire the views. By late afternoon, we found a small clearing by a creek and decided to set up camp. The trees were packed tightly around us, their trunks thick and twisted like old bones. The silence was almost oppressive, like the whole forest was holding its breath. As we unpacked, I noticed something strange. There were no birds, no insects either. The usual sounds of the forest were conspicuously absent. I mentioned it to Tom, but he just shrugged it off, saying it was probably just the time of year. I tried to push the unease from my mind, but it clung to me, stubborn as a shadow. As night fell, the atmosphere grew heavier, the silence deeper. We lit a fire, its light barely penetrating the darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. We shared a couple of beers and laughed, trying to shake the tension. But no matter how much we joked, the feeling of being watched never went away. Around midnight, Tom decided to turn in. I wasn't tired yet, so I stayed up, watching the fire dance and flicker. The woods were pitch black beyond the glow of the flames, an inky void that seemed to devour everything. Just as I was about to douse the fire and head to bed, I heard it, a faint whispering sound like a voice carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was just the trees, but as I listened, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. I strained to hear, but the words were garbled, impossible to make out. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew better. I stood up and scanned the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the fire and the blackness beyond. I shook my head, trying to shake off the fear, and crawled into the tent, zipping it tight. I lay there, listening, but the whispers had stopped. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off to sleep. I woke with a start a few hours later. My heart was pounding, my skin slick with sweat. I'd had a nightmare, though I couldn't remember the details. I glanced over at Tom, but he was still sound asleep. I lay there in the dark, my ears straining for any sound, any sign that we weren't alone. And then I heard it again, the whispering, closer this time. I sat up, holding my breath. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and I could finally make out the words. "Go away, you shouldn't be here." The voice was low and guttural, barely more than a growl. I felt a cold hand of fear grip my heart. I wanted to wake Tom, but something told me not to. I stayed frozen in place, listening to the voice as it repeated the same phrase over and over, like a broken record. Suddenly, the tent shook, as if something was pushing against it from the outside. I stifled a scream, my mind racing with fear. The shaking stopped, but I could feel a presence outside, something massive and malevolent. I took a deep breath, unzipped the tent just a fraction, and peered out. At first, I saw nothing, just the darkness pressing in from all sides. Then I saw it, a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me from the trees. They were a sickly yellow, reflecting the faint light from the dying fire. They blinked slowly, as if sizing me up. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The creature stepped forward, and I saw it more clearly. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, gangly limbs and a body covered in matted fur. Its face was grotesque, a twisted parody of a human face with a long snout and razor-sharp teeth. It looked like something out of a nightmare, something that shouldn't exist. I must have made a sound because the creature's head snapped in my direction. It let out a low growl that rumbled through the ground, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The creature took another step forward, and I knew I had to act fast. I scrambled out of the tent, shouting for Tom. He woke with a start, his face pale with confusion and fear. I pointed to the creature, but by then it had disappeared back into the trees. Tom looked at me like I was crazy, but the look in my eyes must have convinced him. "We need to leave," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. Tom nodded, and we packed up our gear in record time, our hands shaking with fear. As we made our way back through the forest, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those yellow eyes watching us from the shadows. The walk back to the car was a blur of terror and paranoia. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves felt like a threat. The forest was alive with shadows, and I could feel something following us, lurking just out of sight. Finally, we reached the car and threw our gear inside, slamming the doors shut. I started the engine, and we sped down the dirt road, leaving the forest behind. Neither of us spoke, the silence heavy with unspoken fear. As we reached the edge of the forest, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I saw those yellow eyes staring back at me from the darkness. Then they were gone, swallowed by the trees. We drove in silence all the way back to town. Tom and I didn't talk about what had happened. Not that night, not ever. We both knew that whatever we'd seen, whatever had followed us, was something that couldn't be explained, something that belonged to the darkness of the whispering woods. It took me weeks to shake the feeling of being watched. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced those yellow eyes were staring at me from the shadows. And sometimes, just before I fell asleep, I'd hear it, the whispering. It was faint, barely more than a breath, but it was there. "Go away, you shouldn't be here." I tried to move on, to forget, but the memory clung to me, festering like a wound that wouldn't heal. And then, about a month later, I got a call. It was Tom. He sounded frantic, his words slurred with fear. "I saw it," he whispered. "Last night, outside my window. It's here." The line went dead. I tried calling him back, but there was no answer. I drove to his house the next day, but he was gone. His car was in the driveway, the lights were on, but there was no sign of him. I called the police, but they couldn't find anything either. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I returned home that night, my mind reeling with fear and confusion. I sat in the dark, waiting for the whispers to start, for the yellow eyes to appear. But the house was silent, the shadows empty. It's been a year now, and I still think about that weekend in the woods, about Tom and the creature with the yellow eyes. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for its next victim. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear it. The whispering, faint but unmistakable. "Go away, you shouldn't be here." And I know deep down that it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. I've always loved the woods, camping, hiking, anything that got me out into nature. I thought I knew the forest, understood it. But nothing could prepare me for what happened on that trip, the trip that changed how I see the world forever. It started out as an innocent enough idea, a weekend getaway in the deep woods. My friend Kevin had recently bought a piece of land way up north, miles from the nearest town. It was just him, me, and our mutual friend Jess. Kevin was so excited to show off his property, and he convinced us that a few nights out there would be the adventure of a lifetime. When we arrived, the place looked like a paradise. The trees were ancient and tall, their thick branches forming a green canopy that stretched as far as the eye could see. The air was crisp, the silence only broken by the occasional chirping of birds or the rustling of leaves. We set up camp right at the edge of a massive clearing, surrounded on all sides by thick forest. It felt like we were the only people left in the world. That first night was peaceful. We lit a fire, cooked some food, and talked until late in the evening. Around midnight, Jess and I decided to head to bed, but Kevin, in his typical fashion, insisted on staying up a bit longer to stargaze. I fell asleep to the sounds of the crackling fire and the soft breeze blowing through the trees. Sometime in the early morning, maybe around 3 a.m., I woke up. The fire was out, the campsite was dead silent, and the only light came from the sliver of the moon peeking through the branches. I lay there, trying to fall back asleep, but something felt off. The air was heavy, almost suffocating. Then I heard footsteps. They were soft, but unmistakable. Someone or something was walking just outside my tent. My first thought was Kevin, probably drunk and stumbling around in the dark. But as I listened, it became clear that these footsteps didn't sound like a person. They were too light, too measured, and they circled the tent, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, listening intently, until eventually the footsteps faded away into the woods. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a deer, maybe a fox. But even then, I knew that wasn't quite right. It felt too calculated, and animals don't circle tents like that as if watching. The next morning, Kevin was already up and grinning like an idiot when Jess and I emerged from our tents. "You guys missed a hell of a night," he said, sipping his coffee. "I saw a ton of shooting stars. I bet you were both asleep before they even started." "Yeah, well, some of us can't stay up all night," Jess shot back, rolling her eyes. Kevin shrugged, not bothered in the slightest. But as we started to pack our gear for a day hike, I noticed something odd. Kevin had made a sort of barrier around the clearing, small piles of stones every few feet, circling our camp. "What's with the rock art?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "Oh, that?" Kevin grinned again, this time with a hint of mischief. "I read somewhere that making circles like that wards off bad spirits. Figured it couldn't hurt." I laughed it off, but Jess looked uneasy. "Bad spirits? What, like ghosts?" Kevin just winked and said, "You never know." We set off on our hike, and despite my lingering discomfort from the night before, it turned into a pretty great day. We trekked through dense trees, crossed small creeks, and climbed up a hill that gave us an incredible view of the valley below. For those hours, everything seemed right with the world. But as the sun began to set, we realized we'd hiked farther than we intended. We had to rush back to camp, the light fading quickly, and by the time we returned, the entire forest was shrouded in a thick, eerie darkness. We lit the fire again, and as we settled down, that heavy feeling from the night before returned, like the woods were pressing in on us. It started small at first. Kevin kept glancing over his shoulder, staring into the forest as if he expected to see something. Jess was quieter than usual, nervously fidgeting with the straps of her backpack, and then we heard it. A faint, hollow knocking sound, echoing from somewhere deep within the trees. It was rhythmic, like someone tapping on wood. 3 slow knocks, silence. Then 3 more knocks, over and over again. "What the hell is that?" Jess whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Woodpecker?" I offered weakly, knowing full well that it was too late for a woodpecker to be out, and that no woodpecker sounded like that. Kevin didn't say anything. He just stared into the darkness, his eyes wide. And then he said something that chilled me to my core. "The trees are moving," he whispered. I followed his gaze, squinting into the shadows beyond the campfire's glow. At first I saw nothing but darkness, but then I noticed it. The trees at the edge of the clearing were swaying, but there was no wind, and they weren't moving like trees normally would. They twisted and bent unnaturally, like they were being pushed aside by something big, or many somethings. The knocking grew louder, closer, and then we heard a new sound, a low, raspy whisper, like someone trying to speak through a mouthful of mud. It was everywhere and nowhere all at once, surrounding us, weaving in and out of the knocking. "We need to go," Jess said, grabbing her flashlight and jumping to her feet. Kevin shook his head. "No, we can't go out there, not now." "Then what the hell do we do?" she snapped. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. The whispers fell silent. The only sound left was our heavy breathing and the crackling of the dying fire. Maybe it's over," I said, trying to sound hopeful. But then I heard it. Something dragging itself across the ground. Something wet and heavy. And it was coming from right behind Kevin's tent. I grabbed a burning stick from the fire, holding it up like a torch, and took a shaky step toward the sound. Jess shone her flashlight, and in that moment, the beam cut through the darkness to reveal nothing. Just the ground and the leaves. But as the light swept across, the ground seemed to ripple, like something slithering just beneath the surface. "We have to leave," Kevin finally agreed, his voice barely above a whisper. We scrambled to pack up whatever we could grab, but as we did, I noticed something terrifying. The piles of rocks that Kevin had set up around the clearing had been knocked over. Every single one. We didn't bother to find the trail, we just ran, the flashlights bouncing wildly, our breaths ragged. And as we fled, I could hear them, the whispers, the knocking growing louder and louder, as if the whole forest was coming alive. It took us nearly an hour to reach the car, and by then the sky was starting to lighten, the first hints of dawn breaking through. We drove in silence, each of us too afraid to say anything, too afraid to even look at each other. When we finally reached town, I glanced back toward the forest, and I swear, just before we turned the corner, I saw them, the trees, swaying and bending, as if waving goodbye. None of us talked much after that. Kevin sold the property a month later, but he never told the new owners about what happened. And sometimes, I wonder if they ever went out there, if they sat around the campfire at night, hearing the knocking, the whispers, the sounds of something moving just beneath the trees. I don't go camping anymore, not after that night. Because now, every time I see a tree sway in the wind, I wonder if it's really just the wind, or if they're waiting for someone to come close enough to listen. There's something about camping in the deep woods that always gave me a thrill, a mixture of fear and excitement. But after what happened on that trip last year, I'll never step foot into the wilderness again. It was supposed to be a weekend of adventure, just me, my girlfriend Anna, and our friend Greg. We were headed to a remote area we'd never been to before, about 5 hours from town, in a state park that Greg had read about online. He claimed it was perfect for an off-the-grid experience. No people, no distractions, just us and nature. The drive out was beautiful, golden fields, winding mountain roads, and eventually the forest swallowed us whole. The deeper we went, the fewer signs of civilization we saw. By the time we reached the trailhead, it felt like we were 1,000,000 miles away from anywhere. The campsite Greg picked was deep in the forest, a 3-hour hike from the trailhead. As we made our way through the trees, the air grew cooler and the canopy above grew thicker, blocking out most of the sunlight. It was peaceful but also unnervingly quiet. No birds, no wind, just our footsteps crunching through the underbrush. By the time we found the clearing, the sun had started to dip below the horizon. We set up our tents and got a fire going, just in time for the first hints of night to settle in. The spot was strange, though. Even though it was deep in the woods, the clearing seemed too perfect. The trees formed a near circle around it, and there were no signs of wildlife, no deer tracks, no birds, not even a squirrel. Just silence. As the fire crackled, we tried to shake off the weird vibes, telling ourselves it was just the isolation playing tricks on us. We joked, ate, and shared stories, but as the night deepened, that creeping feeling of unease returned. I could feel it in my gut, like something was watching us from the trees, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Around midnight, Greg decided to go for a walk to gather more firewood. "Be back in 10, he said, grabbing his flashlight and heading toward the trees. Anna and I sat by the fire, listening to the faint crack of branches as he disappeared into the darkness. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. "Where the hell is he?" Anna asked, her voice tense. "I don't know, maybe he got lost. I'll go find him," I said, grabbing my flashlight. The moment I stepped into the woods, the quiet was overwhelming. It was like the forest was holding its breath. I called out Greg's name, but there was no response. My light barely penetrated the darkness. The trees seemed to loom closer, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal arms. I walked for what felt like ages, but I didn't find any trace of Greg. No footprints, no broken branches. Nothing. The strangest part? I couldn't hear him either. No crunching leaves, no distant voice. It was like he had simply vanished. My chest tightened with panic, and I rushed back to the campsite expecting to find Anna waiting. But when I emerged from the trees, she was gone too. The fire was still crackling, her flashlight resting beside her empty chair. My heart hammered in my chest. I called out her name, shouting louder and louder, but the only answer I got was the echo of my own voice bouncing back through the trees. I grabbed both flashlights and started searching the perimeter of the clearing. The forest felt wrong. The way the trees seemed to twist unnaturally in the darkness. The overwhelming stillness. The smell of damp earth and something rotten, like decaying leaves. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing where Greg had disappeared earlier, there was a faint glow, just barely visible through the dense trees. It wasn't firelight. It was whiter, softer, almost like a mist. My pulse raced as I approached, flashlight trembling in my hand. The closer I got, the more I realized the glow wasn't coming from a light source. It was coming from something else. The trees began to thin out as I reached the source. My breath hitched in my throat when I saw it. A clearing, another one. Only this one was different. It was smaller, maybe only 20 feet wide, and at the center stood what I could only describe as the remnants of an old campsite. Rotten, collapsed tents, the skeleton of a fire pit, rusted camping gear scattered on the ground, overgrown with moss and vines. And then I saw them, 3 tents much like ours but disintegrating. Something about them seemed eerily familiar. My mind raced. Could this be some kind of forgotten campsite? But it looked ancient, like it had been abandoned for decades. I shone my light over the collapsed tents, and that's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Scattered across the ground, just visible under the layers of leaves and dirt, were old faded photographs. I bent down, picking one up with trembling fingers. It was a picture of 3 people standing in front of a campfire, smiling. My heart stopped. It was us. Me, Anna, and Greg. My hands shook as I flipped through more of the pictures. They were all of us, arriving at the campsite, setting up our tents, sitting around the fire. But they looked old. The edges of the photos were worn, yellowed with time. And then I noticed the last photo. It was of the clearing I stood in now, but there was something horribly wrong. The 3 of us, Anna, Greg, and I, were lying on the ground in unnatural positions, limbs twisted, faces contorted in silent screams. I dropped the pictures, stumbling back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. This couldn't be real. How were these pictures here? And why did they show us dead? Suddenly I heard a voice behind me. Looking for something? I spun around, my flashlight flickering wildly. Standing at the edge of the clearing was Greg, but something was off. His face was blank, his eyes empty, like he wasn't fully there. "Greg, where's Anna?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, the empty expression on his face never changing. Behind him, the trees seemed to shift, shadows moving unnaturally between the branches. I backed away, the flashlight shaking in my hand. "Greg, what's going on? Where's Anna?" But Greg wasn't Greg anymore. He tilted his head slightly, a twisted smile spreading across his face as he stepped into the clearing, his movements slow, deliberate, as if he was being controlled by something else. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't look back. I just sprinted through the trees, the sound of footsteps echoing behind me, growing faster, closer. The forest felt like a labyrinth, the trees closing in, branches clawing at my clothes and skin. I don't know how long I ran before I stumbled onto the trail again, panting and soaked in sweat. I never looked back. I don't even know if Greg, or whatever was chasing me, was still following. I eventually made it back to the car, but I was alone. I called the rangers, told them everything, but they found nothing. No sign of Anna, no sign of Greg. Just an empty campsite and a fire that had long since burned out. That forgotten clearing, it doesn't show up on any maps, but I'll never forget what I saw there, or the photos of us lying dead on the ground. Whoever or whatever took those pictures is still out there, in those woods waiting for the next group of campers to stumble upon their twisted game. And I'll never go back to find out what happens next.